Well, thank you. Let's resume. So Roderick's got, I think, one more bit of questioning, and then we'll move to Sir Lawrence Freedman. Thank you, by the way.
Yes, I'm sorry you've had to listen to the sound of my voice for so long, but I promise you relief in a few minutes. The Middle East peace process, you, the Prime Minister, Sir David Manning, pressed very, very strongly, very persistently, really throughout 2002 and into 2003, in the context of the negotiations or discussions we were having with the American administration about Iraq. You pressed the urgent need for progress on the Middle East peace process. If you will forgive me a rather long quotation, in his evidence, Sir Christopher Mayer, on this point, said the following: the high point of British influence on the Arab-Israel dispute was the American statement of the 4th of April, that's 2002, just before Crawford, in which, at a time when the Israeli Defense Force was in the West Bank towns creating some damage and casualties, the Americans called for Israel's early withdrawal from the West Bank towns. He went on to say, no sooner had that statement come out demanding the early withdrawal of the Israeli forces from the West Bank than a major political operation was launched in Washington the following week to reverse the nature of that call. Colin Powell had been sent to the region, and when he came back, he was strongly of the view that he had been consistently undermined by his enemies while he was away, in the administration, in the US Congress, and by someone who is now the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, coming to Washington and effectively working against him. The definitive American statement was then one made in June, which rode back a long way from what they had said on the 4th of April, and effectively said, in a practical sense, that, quote, we will leave the Middle East on a care and maintenance basis, and by the way, we're not going to do anything until the Palestinians democratize themselves, unquote, and what that means is getting rid of Yasser Arafat, which he didn't do until he died. Now that's all the quotation from Sir Christopher Mayer's evidence, because it sums up a number of aspects about this negotiation. And the fact is that by the time the conflict began in March of 2003, we hadn't managed to secure progress from the American administration on the Middle East peace process, except for a very belated agreement to publish the famous route map. Why were we unable to get that progress that was such an important point for us?
Well, there are related reasons. There was never real agreement inside the European Union about what to do in respect of the Middle East. Endless discussions in foreign ministers' meetings and in the heads of government and foreign minister level. But in the absence of a very clear, agreed and enforced strategy by the European Union, the only serious player in the Middle East is the United States. And I don't believe that we're going to get that a serious consensus in the European Union for many decades, mainly for historical reasons. What then has to be understood, and I know you do understand it, Sir Roderick, but it's just worth repeating, is the unique nature of the relationship between Israel and the government of Israel and the United States. It's to do with how Israel was founded, with what is regarded in Israel and by the Jewish community as an unambiguous support for Israel, whereas there is a high level of reality to their claim that our approach was very ambiguous, and indeed laid the foundations for the later problems we've had with contradictory policy positions like the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Agreement and all the things that followed from that. But the truth, and then coupled with that, you've got this inherent underlying instability of the Israeli political system, because they've got this completely ludicrous system of proportional representation, and of the worst kind. So the coalition is they were constantly under threat. Now, add to that what I think is a very interesting, often overlooked part of this brew, is the way in which the Republican Party and the Bush family in particular were traumatized by the very courageous efforts of Bush 41 to take on the Israeli government, which is what he did, and James Baker did, in the aftermath of the First Gulf War. James Baker and Bush 41 were the last American administration to seek to face down the government of Israel. And if you remember, Baker went to the region and suspended their debt facilities and their subsidies. Within the Republican Party and the Bush family, that has led to the view, which I think is probably accurate, that was critical in tipping support in key states amongst the Jewish community from Bush to Clinton. And it is certainly a matter of record that Clinton was merciless with Bush 41 for the fact that he'd not stood up for Israel. So, and that was there because it just happens to be true that the Republican Party is generally not been the one that represented the Jewish community. It's a Democratic Party, but they'd managed one way or another to get some of the Jewish community over to them through sort of alliance with the evangelical Christian movement. But all that was there. And you then had people in Washington who felt passionately about Israel and its survival, because, for very obvious reasons. I mean, I feel passionately about Israel and its survival too. I just happen to think the policy of the United States and the policy of Israel to secure that survival is generally wrong. But anyway, we're talking about Washington. So it's a really difficult environment. What Tony Blair sought to do all the way through his premiership was to raise the Middle East up the agenda with Washington and to get some change. And he was relentless in seeking to do that, and I completely shared his agenda. It's a matter of huge frustration that we weren't able to achieve that. And for example, when great efforts were made to democratize the Palestinian Authority, the elections which were forced on the Palestinian Authority were mistimed. They led to the obvious result, which was Hamas would win. And then the international community, rather than perfectly obvious it was going to happen, rather than anticipating that, allowed it to happen, and then said, well, we're not now going to recognize the result because we don't agree with the consequence of the election. So all those things, I say, we're in the brew.
The frustration you've just expressed has been reflected by other witnesses. Jonathan Powell, for example, talked of his disappointment, and others have too. But effectively what you're saying is you and the Prime Minister were pushing on the White House in one direction, the Israeli government was pushing in the other direction, and the Israelis won.
Well, it's a more subtle point than that. I mean, it depended on the circumstances. It depended on what was happening on the ground in Israel and the occupied territories, all sorts of things. And we made some progress. Actually, the roadmap is not to be dismissed. It was a very important achievement. But if I look back on that period, yes, it was very frustrating. And it was a consequence, say, of this huge pressure by the Israelis and their supporters in the American administration, and above all, within the Bush administration, it was those supporters who sought to actively to undermine Secretary Powell.